Good morning from Aberystwyth on the west coast of Wales in the United Kingdom. It's a pleasure to be joining you, and thank you to Evelyn for her very kind invitation to speak with you all, and congratulations to Evelyn and to the organising committee on organising this conference. I'd like to dedicate this talk to Professor Mike Pearson, a colleague, a mentor and friend who passed away in May. Mike's influence, I'm sure many of you will be familiar with his work. His influence as a performance maker and a thinker of performance is profound, and he is very much missed. So the COVID-19 pandemic has unsettled our acts of theatrical assembly, if indeed they were ever truly settled. COVID-19 has provided a catalyst for us to rethink some of our assumptions about theatre and performance, about the world in which we make it, and about its relationship to that world. As an ecological crisis, the pandemic has disrupted the operation of performance spaces as physical sites of assembly by requiring us to adapt to the unseen and often undetectable presence of a virus. As a result, many theatres and performance spaces have closed for extended periods. Others have altered seating patterns to enable physical distancing, adjusted production processes, or sought to enhance their ventilation. Still others have altered their function and programming, serving as sites for the distribution of food and support to the communities around them, or as spaces of advocacy. And many have found themselves the subject of questions and campaigns as the pandemic has exposed the inequitable status quo of theatrical production and highlighted issues including precarious working conditions, exclusionary practices, structural inequalities, and ecologically ruinous resource use. Alongside this, the widespread adoption of event streaming and digital media during the pandemic has asked us to consider digital platforms as performance spaces and performance itself as an assemblage, which can happen in multiple places with and for different groups of people simultaneously. In such a context, the question of what contemporary theatre or performance space might be seems more complicated than ever, as well as more open and certainly more urgent. As curator of the Performance Space exhibition at the 2023 Prague Quadrennial of Performance Design and Space, usually known as the PQ, I want to use the pandemic as a catalyst for reconsidering the operations and functions of performance spaces. The exhibition is titled Acts of Assembly, and my aim is that it serve as a forum for considering how performance spaces operate as acts of assembly and sites for community. How do they create connections? How do they facilitate encounters? How do they function as spaces for social action and the making of culture? What underpins these three central questions is an acknowledgement that theatre venues and performance spaces not only provide the infrastructure for various assemblies, but are themselves spatially and materially performative. Performance spaces afford different conditions for encounter, relation, appearance, and participation through their location and position, their articulation of space, the materials they are constructed from, the ways they are managed and programmed, and of course their histories. Writing in a post-colonial Kenyan context, Ngugi wa Thiong'o identifies performance spaces as sites where internal and external forces and relations are negotiated in the context of time and history. For Thiong'o, the key quality of performance space is its openness, understood physically and politically, an openness he sets against the repressive confinement of the state. Now, the theme for the 2023 PQ is rare. It invites us to reflect on the importance of live events and encounters, and on the way scenography and performance design work with the specifics of situations, environments, and materials. And with this theme, PQ Artistic Director Marketa Fantova encourages us to celebrate the preciousness of artistic practices that create connections between people. Quote, "In the current state of precarity, uncertainty, and epochal change," she writes, "we call on performance designers, scenographers, and performance practitioners to use their rare imagination and creativity to help us envisage what the world and theatre could look like in the post-pandemic future." End quote. Echoing this main theme, the performance space exhibition could also be called Rare Acts of Assembly. As curator, I want to attend to the uncommon spaces and practices in which we might glimpse future possibilities for performance space, and through which we might respond meaningfully to the social, political, and ecological challenges we face. So in this talk, I will introduce and contextualize my concept for the performance space exhibition and explain how the related concepts of assembly and assemblage help us focus on the way performance spaces function as vital social infrastructures. I start by reflecting on the Prague Quadrennial and how its evolution has reflected shifts in scenographic practice and the relationship between theatre and architecture. Then I discuss how the concepts of assembly and assemblage emerged from the Ever After project, which sought to respond to the pandemic by developing creative tools and operational strategies for performance making. I then reflect on how the concept of assembly helpfully connects theatre and performance spaces to the unsettling energies of demonstrations and public assemblies, as well as asking us to think about the interconnections and interdependencies between the human and the more than human. And I finish by outlining some of my intentions and methods for the staging of the exhibition. The Prague Quadrennial and performance space then. Established in 1967, the Prague Quadrennial, or PQ as it is commonly known, is the leading international festival of scenography and performance design. And its transformation in recent decades from an exhibition to a festival reflects important shifts in the development of these art forms. Originally modeled on the Sao Paulo Biennale, there we go, Biennale, the PQ has historically focused on the integral contribution of scenography to theatrical events, and it's been organized via a series of sections. A main competitive exhibition of stage work from different nations, displays of student work, a thematic section where designers respond to a specified theme, and a section devoted to theatre architecture. Over time, significant changes have taken place in the PQ's organization and focus. In the late 1990s, a shift towards live performance and displays instead of exhibits of photographs and artifacts began. And from 2003, the PQ has transformed as a result of the expansion of scenographic practice, and it has embraced performance, audience interaction, sensory experience, and the city of Prague itself. The shift from an exhibition towards a multimodal event and the expansion of scenography beyond traditional scenic design is reflected in the change of the PQ's name in 2008 from the Prague Quadrennial International Exhibition of Stage Design and Theatre Architecture to the Prague Quadrennial of Performance Design and Space. Soja Lotka, artistic director of PQ from 2008 until 2015, has argued that while recent changes might seem to be a rejection of the PQ's past, she sees them as a quote, continuation of the creation of space for challenging scenography. The Quadrennial not only as a place of static display of existing projects, but also a place of research, creation, and experimentation, end quote. So, what does it mean to exhibit theatre architecture and performance space in such a context? What Soja Lotka has called the paradox of exhibiting scenography, that scenography when exhibited is removed from the context of performance, equally applies to an exhibition of performance space where space is rendered static, an object represented via image, diagram, or model, rather than a dynamic and fluid force. Another challenge is the very problematizing of theatre architecture itself within an expanded field of scenography and performance design. As Juliet Rufford and I argued in Performing Architectures, the spatial turn, the emergence of performance as critical concept and field of practice, and the emergence of site-specific approaches to performance making mean that the key critical issues in the design of theatre architecture and performance space are now entangled in broader questions about the relationship between performance and architecture. A brief survey of the recent history of the architecture section of PQ demonstrates different attempts to negotiate this shifting territory. In 2003, for instance, the architecture section sought to go beyond traditional modes of representing architecture and to serve as a meeting place for architects and students of architecture and theatre schools and every kind of theatre creator. But it was largely overshadowed by the innovation of what was called the Heart of PQ. This was a large-scale Seno-architectural installation and program of live events curated by Thomas Žižka and designed by Dorita Hanna. Installed in the central hall of the Prague exhibition grounds, the Heart of PQ explored the senses in performance. It challenged the separation of scenography and architecture, and it offered a vision of scenography in progress. So it was a series of experiments over the course of 10 days, a kind of residency program, if you will. At the next PQ in 2007, the gold medal for best theatre architecture was actually not awarded, with jury member Dorita Hanna observing that, quote, the most exciting venues were the found spaces for site-specific projects, where performance refused to be contained and chose to leave its traditional confines and wander, free from those dark and disciplining interiors in search of more complex and challenging sites, unquote. And instead, and somewhat ironically, an honorary mention was given to Spain for their presentation of an online observatory of theatres at risk, focused on historic theatre buildings. For 2011, the architecture section was installed in the Prague Crossroads, a deconsecrated church in the historic centre of the city. Titling the exhibition Now/Next, Performance Space at the Crossroads, now Commissioner Dorita Hanna developed a tripartite structure that featured an exhibition of performance space now, a display of national exhibits, then Between, which were commissioned video works, and Next, an open spatial laboratory. Reflecting on the exhibition, architect Beth Weinstein commented that, quote, signs for the future seem to point away from the cult of the object building as intervention, separated from the civic space around it. And she also commented that many of the projects exhibited, quote, offered interwoven relationships between large urban spaces or landscapes and the specific site or sites of the performances, end quote. At the 2015 edition of the PQ, the architecture section was retitled Performing Space, or the ephemeral section of architecture. And it was reimagined by Commissioner Serge von Arx as a series of performance tours through the city of Prague that explored the intertwining nature of scenography and architecture. And finally, in the most recent edition of PQ in 2019, curator Andrew Todd proposed the concept of Our Theatre of the World for what was then renamed the Performance Space Exhibition. And Todd invited submissions in the form of short films that contained the insights of designers of spaces and the users of those spaces. What is evident through these shifts is the struggle to maintain a presence for theatre architecture in the PQ, and the shift to performance space as a term that better reflects the diversity of sites, settings, and environments in which performative events take place. A common thread also is the future-facing orientation of past exhibitions and the way past commissioners and curators have sought to reveal and research new understandings and practices through talks, dialogues, workshops, tours, and performative experiments. A static vision of architecture as object is giving way to a performative vision of architecture as event, which complicates the idea of exhibiting performance space. Doreen Massey proposes that we, quote, recognize space as the product of interrelations, as constituted through interactions, from the immensity of the global to the intimately tiny. To this, she adds that space is, quote, the sphere of the possibility of the existence of multiplicity, and is therefore, quote, always under construction. Performance possesses a transformative power to generate spatiality. And Dorita Hanna's development of the term event space, which he describes as a means of articulating how space performs through time and movement, and how performance is spatialized via the event, specifically in theatre architecture, draws our attention to the reciprocal forces at play. As Hanna has also persuasively argued, performance is uncontainable, and the design of theatres and performance spaces requires complexity and dynamism, resilience and transience. As theatre architecture has been problematized and its traditional typologies creatively and critically reassessed, and in many instances rejected, scenography and performance design have expanded to take an active role in the authoring of social space. But despite this, theatres continue to play vital roles socially and artistically as sites of encounter, resistance, and communal experience. So through a curatorial focus on the dynamics of different acts of assembly and a framing of performance as an assemblage, the Performance Space exhibition at PQ23 will seek to explore the productive continuities and antagonisms between traditional theatre architecture and the broader emerging qualities of performance space. Examining the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on theatre and performance is vital for thinking about these continuities and antagonisms and looking to possible futures for theatre and performance spaces. This is because the pandemic is not just a public health crisis, but it's a reminder and a warning that we are, as a species, necessarily entangled and embedded in the Earth's ecosystems. The pandemic has not only exposed the frailties and limitations of existing theatre venues and practices, but it also points towards the severity of the broader ecological crises we face, environmental and social. In this section of my talk, I want to reflect on the catalytic potential of the COVID-19 pandemic through the lens of the Ever After project, and offer some context for my interest in these related concepts of assembly and assemblage. The Ever After project was an attempt to explore the implications of the pandemic for theatre and performance in a way that might encourage the emergence of new forms. It was initiated by theatre maker Mike Pearson in April 2020, and it was a conceptual and design-led project run by National Theatre Wales in partnership with academics and practitioners from Aberystwyth University and the Institute of Making at University College London. Led by Mike Pearson, the core research group was comprised of artist and director Mike Brooks, who frequently has collaborated with Mike Pearson as Pearson Brooks, artist, broadcaster, and director of the Institute of Making, Zoe Laughlin, and me. The project sought to respond to the pandemic by assessing its likely impacts and conceiving viable ways forward by imagining and proposing transferable principles and proposals and recommendations for new approaches to the practices of theatre. Now, National Theatre Wales, or NTW, as they are usually called, were in a unique position organisationally to ponder the possibilities of future theatre making during the pandemic. They were founded in 2010 as Wales's English language national theatre. The nation of Wales within the United Kingdom, I'm going a little off script here, is a bilingual country, and it has two national theatres, a Welsh-speaking national theatre and an English language national theatre. Now, NTW, the English language national theatre, are a non-building based company who have forged a significant track record of located and context-specific productions across the length and breadth of Wales. Wales is a very a very spread out country in many ways. It's a tiny country, I admit, but the population is spread and the transport infrastructure is not great. It's very difficult to get from north to south, almost impossible by public transport. And so rather than operate a touring model, NTW work project to project with different artistic teams in very specific locations. And the company also facilitated an online social network. So for this reason, NTW were therefore well positioned to engage in a dialogue over their past activities and their future aspirations during the months of lockdown in the pandemic. Methodologically, Ever After drew on Bruno Latour's call to use the disruption of the pandemic to take stock of what we wanted to see return after the crisis. In a short essay published in March 2020, in the first months of the pandemic and its lockdown, particularly in the UK, Latour and across Europe, Latour suggested that we take advantage of the enforced suspension of most activities to set out the inventory of those among them we would like to see not coming back, and those, on the other hand, that we would like to see develop. In this, Latour saw the pandemic as an opportunity to contest global systems of production in order to avoid a return to business as usual. Now, influenced by Latour's suggestion, we examined 6 dimensions of performance where the impact of COVID-19 could be examined. Structured as an inquiry into 6 thematic blocks, we focused first on assembly, then on relationships, materiality and design, then space and architecture, then techniques and expression, and finally on production processes. But it was the question of assembly, of how we gather in changed and changing circumstances that remain throughout. And this was reinforced by our mediated witness of protest gatherings in Tel Aviv and Athens, showing demonstrators gathered in neat 2-meter intervals across public squares. And then the furious eruptions of the Black Lives Matter protests in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. And the images I'm showing there of the pulling down of one particular statue of a slaver in the city of Bristol called Edward Colston back in summer of 2020. The question of how we gather, in what configurations and by what means, formed a central thread. And the project, the Ever After project, highlighted the value of assemblage thinking. Assemblage thinking can be traced from the work of Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari through to thinkers like Manuel de Landa and Jane Bennett. To think in terms of assemblages is to think relationally and to position oneself within and amongst, affected, implicated, interfolded. It is to recognize that performance takes place as an unsteady constellation of bodies, things, materials, and forces, and that theatrical form is malleable and always reconfigurable. So if it was clear from our consideration of assembly that theatre faced a profound problem of not knowing how to go on in the pandemic, then it was also clear that the street, as Mike Brooks put it, was a place to look for clues. And, quote, to the ways that we are already and always finding and refinding, to self-organize and perform ourselves in the less defined public spaces we have to live in. It was also evident that alternative or experimental forms of performance, durational, peripatetic, landscape, installation, autoteatro, intermedial, offered various ways forward. Meanwhile, the theatre auditorium, previously critiqued by Dorita Hanna as a disciplinary or carceral space, was rendered a space of paranoia. In summer of 2020, the widely circulated image of the gap-toothed auditorium of the Theater am Schiffbaudamm in Berlin, Bertolt Brecht's former theatre, with swathes of its seats removed to provide some degree of safety, merely reinforced the pervasive sense of the virus's presence. It also reveals, I think, the extent to which the traditional theatre auditorium is an anthropocentric apparatus, adapted to the particular set of stable ecological conditions we've enjoyed in the Holocene, but perhaps ill-adapted to the instabilities of the Anthropocene. What emerged from Ever After were a number of propositions which we offered to National Theatre Wales, focused on developing and extending its history of context-specific production beyond the pandemic. We proposed, for instance, that every production might be conceived as an integrated act of project design, in which form and scale could be adapted according to spatial and cultural context. Further, we propose that the need for the basic components of theatre, text, action, sonography, soundtrack, and technology might be reconsidered on a project-by-project basis. So for NTW, you don't need to include everything in every production. And we propose that the company seek to enhance connectivity to enable performance to be in many places simultaneously. Spatially, we imagine sets of performance conditions like those found in public space, where we must negotiate each other's presence and find ways to self-organize. And Zoe Laughlin's concept, and this is her image on the screen, of a threshold of responsibility in which performance space might exist as a minimal shelter between the more codified rules of the auditorium on the right-hand side and the less codified rules of the landscape, articulates the sort of negotiations between individual and institutional responsibility that might operate in different forms of gathering. One shared vision from our research group was the dematerialization of theatre architecture and its replacement with what we called an infrastructural auditorium, somewhat grandly perhaps, an infrastructure for seeing and hearing within which an audience might be located and oriented through performance design. We thought of the theatre auditorium less as an architecture and more as this tactical infrastructure. And we recommended to the company the establishment of a dedicated space which they could use to test various assemblies and different configurations of performer and spectator with the integration of different technologies. And this is something we referred to shorthand as a broadcastable Dutch barn, a Dutch barn being a kind of open-sided barn in the landscape, as visualized in this collage image made by Mike Pearson. At the heart of Judith Butler's interest in developing a theory of performative assembly is her identification that there is a war on the idea of interdependency going on the social network of hands that seeks to minimize the unlivability of lives. And in the mass movements and gatherings of people in the Arab Spring uprisings, the Occupy movement, amongst many others, and we can name many others since, Butler sees the reworking or reconfiguration of public space and the possibility of an ethics of cohabitation being asserted against dominant political regimes. While Butler prioritizes the action of bodies, she also acknowledges that bodies are held together and supported. This support is infrastructural, whether in the form of existing locations and architectures, or the material or technical infrastructures that provide food, water, communications, and medical services. Not only do bodies gather and assert their right to appear, they also, according to Butler, maintain themselves and bring into visibility the social forms they seek more generally. Drawing on Butler, Jonas Staal proposes a practice of assemblism, which might work through social movements and support the development of new collectives. Staal's recent project with Radha de Souza, called the Court for Intergenerational Climate Crimes, commissioned in Amsterdam, staged a series of hearings in which prosecutions were pursued against major international corporations, including Unilever, ING, the banking group, and Airbus, as well as the Dutch state. These took place in an exhibition space designed as a forum where members of the public were positioned amongst images of extinct species, so a multi-species assembly. Such exploration of the forms and possibilities for assemblies is an ongoing concern of contemporary artistic practice, whether it's being housed in institutional spaces like galleries or theatres, or taking place in public space. Through these, artists and activists seek to develop possibilities for deliberative and direct decision-making that might contest established hierarchies and offer new ways through entrenched problems. In attending to this notion of assembly, I want to connect performance spaces more directly to these energies, so as to explore how venues and spaces, physical and digital, might better serve as material performative supports for new collectives and forms of collective appearance and decision-making. This is already strong where theatres take up resistant stances to dominant political, economic, or cultural ideologies, where, quote, the power of performance in the arts, and quote, as Thiongo puts it, is in conflict with the enactments of power performed by the state, and where the desire to maintain an open space of cultural experimentation and expression is pursued. Some, like the Oficina group at the Teatro Oficina in Sao Paulo, transgress the boundaries between theatre and everyday life as a form of aesthetico-political activism, while others operate in the mode of laboratories, staging forums or tribunals. Le Theatre de Négociation, Make It Work, staged at the Theatre Nanterre Amandière outside Paris in 2015, transformed an extant national theatre into a stage for a pre-enactment of the negotiations that were to take place during the 21st Conference of the Parties, COP21, the climate change conference in Paris, later in that year. Under the guidance of Bruno Latour, Laurence Tubiana, Philippe Ken, and Frédéric Etauti, the event saw a large group of several hundred students occupy the theatre for a week to simulate the sorts of negotiations that would take place during COP21, but to do so in a manner that also sought to imagine and experiment with how such processes could be reimagined. Etauti observed that the enterprise used all the spaces in the entire theatre building, shifting the entrance, reconfiguring the flow of people through it. But central to the reconfiguration of the space was opening the wall of the flexible black box theatre as a way of signaling, quote, quite literally, that the black box of negotiations could and should be opened to the broadest possible audience. The pandemic has required theatres to rethink how they operate, why and for whom, and this has implications for how we think about performance space. The theatre company Slunglow, founded in 2000 and based in Leeds in the north of England, offers a compelling example of the way in which performance spaces might be reimagined as what sociologist Eric Kleinenberg calls social infrastructure, quote, physical places and organizations that shape the way people interact, end quote, and which he argues are vital for mutual support, resilience, and connection. Slunglow have been based in Holbeck, an inner city area of Leeds, which is marked by high levels of deprivation since 2010. They're a national portfolio organization, so they're in receipt of annual funding from Arts Council England. And so they've previously adopted a policy of making company equipment and resources free to share with others, and also operating a policy of pay what you decide for any events. In 2019, Slunglow developed its civic mission by taking on the management of the Holbeck, which you can see on this slide, the oldest continuously operating working men's club in the United Kingdom, which was established in 1871. Here, they helped to stabilize the club's ailing finances and maintain its existing community spaces, including its bar, while also using it as their base of operations and their performance venue, and also as an open development space for artists. When lockdown restrictions were implemented in March 2020, the company had to temporarily close the Holbeck, but they wrote to local families offering assistance. Then, in response to a request from Leeds City Council, the company agreed to take on social care referrals from the local area during the pandemic. And during 2020 alone, the company fielded over 8,000 referrals, people being sent to them for help. And they also served as a food distribution center. Alongside this, they staged socially distanced in-person and streamed performances from the club and its car park for local families, seeking to mitigate the effects of isolation during lockdown restrictions. Asked why, as a theatre company, they agreed to operate as a food bank and take on social referrals, artistic director Alan Lane's response was that the food bank was the only way we could possibly justify theatre. The company also insisted on running their food bank as a non-means tested self-referral food bank, meaning that they would not ask questions before handing out food parcels, nor would they limit individuals' repeated access to food parcels, as is often common practice in that sector. Slunglow's experience during the pandemic demonstrates the potential of performance spaces as vital social infrastructure, providing physical spaces to support face-to-face interactions, meeting the needs of the local community and making lives livable. And it offers a glimpse of assemblage thinking in action, in which this company shifted its mode of theatrical production to work with a mix of people, food, vehicles, equipment, networks, ideas, and spaces to create new culture, cultural production, and meaning in a very particular set of difficult and evolving contexts. The interconnections and interdependencies between the human and the more than human are another element in how the concept of acts of assembly might prompt us to think further about performance space. How might venues and spaces enable us to better grasp pressing ecological questions by perceiving the Earth not as an inert stage for human action, but a space constantly in the process of being created by living beings? Frédéric Étauty's identification of the Earth as terra forma, shaped by living beings, offers a counterbalance to the terraforming that has been central to colonialism. Here, the openness, which Thiongo posits as key to performance space, needs to be an openness to the agency of non-human others. This action of imaginatively restoring agency and voice to non-humans can be seen in Marjolaine Guldemont's project Compost en Scène at the 2014 Earl Festival. In this work, earthen shapes produced through the actions of worms, bacteria, fungus, and humans created a rhythmic architectural form that framed and reframed the landscape in performance before being gradually subsumed into it. Movement artist Simon Whitehead's work, New Ground, Tir Newydd, reinstates a former dance floor removed from the estate at Plas Glynneweddw in North Wales in the form of scented herbs and plants, which can be danced on barefoot. It's a lovely, lovely idea. Whitehead is also a key figure in the collective curatorial project Maynard Abercych, which offers an ongoing experiment in structure and form, focused on dance and movement in a rural environment. In the small West Wales village of Abercych, Maynard hosts festivals, artist residencies, films, workshops, classes, and a regular twmpath, which is a Welsh form of folk dance or social dance. In Maynard, performance and spatial design is an outworking of the actions of dance and movement artists. Performance space is a consideration, but not the focal point of the practices that are employed. Rather, Maynard is grounded in the lived experience of movement, which attunes to the specificities and affordances of location. It is embedded and entangled in its location in a way which enables the development of new agencies for often urban-based artists and choreographers through embedding them, often just for time-limited residencies, within a working rural landscape. The dominant metaphor within Maynard is that of fabric and threads, of an action of weaving, but also the creation of a tensile mesh. For these reasons, I think Maynard exists as a productive model of contemporary rural performance space, and it speaks back to the primarily urban models of distributed performance space through its attentiveness to the complexities of location and community, through an attentiveness to existing forms of gathering and moving together, through a rhythmic engagement with location, and through an awareness of working across porous boundaries between interior spaces and exterior landscapes. In Maynard, aesthetic events take place in the village in a variety of environments: domestic, community, public, agricultural, natural. The openness of activities to external environmental processes foregrounds their embeddedness. Now, choreographer Anna Halprin's famous dance deck, co-designed by her landscape architect husband, Lawrence Halprin, in the grounds of their California home in the 1950s, serves as what Adrian Heathfield calls a ghost architecture for Maynard. In the essay Before Judson and Some Other Things, Heathfield invokes this notion of a ghost architecture to understand how this famous dance deck came to inform the aesthetics of later dance collectives, particularly the Judson Church in New York. For Heathfield, the dance deck is an architecture constituted through relations between the material, the immaterial, and the organic. Heathfield observes that the dance deck promotes coexistence and symbiosis through its lack of walls. It establishes boundaries that are highly porous and contingent. It reorients both dancer and spectator to multiple possible perspectives through its irregular geometry. It's not a square or a rectangle. It opens up both dancer and performance to environmental processes, and it reconstitutes performance space as moving space. And Halperin herself wrote, quote, "The non-rectangular form of the dance deck forces a complete reorientation of the dancer. The customary points of reference are gone, and in place of a cubic space, all confined by right angles with a front, back, sides, and top, a box within to move, the space explodes and becomes mobile. Movement within a moving space, I have found, is different than movement within a static cube." Now, Halperin's dance deck and Maynard Abakeek catalyze assemblages of human and non-human reciprocal action and offer different but aligned models of performance space in which performance takes place in and through moving, living spaces. So these examples offer glimpses and insights into practices of assembly and assemblage that have much to offer us in considering the futures of performance space. In concluding this talk, I would like to return to the exhibition to discuss the process of curation and to articulate some of my curatorial methods. The PQ, the Prague Quadrennial, operates through issuing open calls for participation across its various exhibitions and programs. So under this title of Acts of Assembly, my open call for the Performance Space exhibition asked for the submission of any type of space that has been created or adapted for performance. Spaces need not have been designed by an architect. They may have been created by scenographers, artists, or by communities themselves. They may be the result of careful planning or sudden urgent action. I invited submissions in the form of a portfolio of material traces, which might provide insight into the specific qualities of the space being submitted, its textures, its atmospheres, its actions, and its operations. And I suggested these could include one or more of the following: a short film, a sound recording, an object or thing, an architectural fragment, or a visual image. And contributors were asked to respond to at least some of the following questions. What does your space do? How does it perform? How does it create space for the appearance of individuals and or communities? How does it negotiate social or cultural differences? I also asked, how has the COVID-19 pandemic shifted or altered the function of your performance space? And how does your performance space create connections between the human and non-human world? People didn't have to address all of these, just maybe address some or one or two. The call has elicited a wide range of responses, and the breadth has been striking. These include new theatre buildings, renovations of existing theatres, and adaptations of found spaces, activist interventions into public space, sites for regular public gatherings, and a number of submissions propose digital and virtual platforms as performance spaces or digitally augmented spaces, reflecting in part the way the pandemic has popularized digitally mediated forms of performance. Now, the exhibition will be located next year on level 5 of the small hall of the starkly functionalist Trade Fair Palace, the Veletržní Palace, part of the National Gallery of Prague, built in 1928. It will share this space with Fragments 2, an exhibition of scenic models. The main site for PQ23 will be the Prague Markets, located on the site of the former city slaughterhouse, a short distance away. Now, the Trade Fair Palace is a space of order and rhythm, and it's in marked contrast to the liveliness and contradictions of the market site. Acknowledging the paradox of exhibiting scenography or performance space mentioned earlier, my intention is the exhibition not just represent acts of assembly and the features of performance spaces, but also embody these by being a space of gathering, which is open to iteration and reconfiguration, and where dialogues, workshops, and performances take place. The creation of an open, iterative, and performative space of assembly is my key curatorial method, a space in which acts of assembly might be encountered and staged, as well as contemplated, and in which the presence of visitors affects the form of the exhibition space. Alongside this, I will also seek to connect the exhibition space with the streets outside, as well as digitally, so that in-person physical gatherings might be connected digitally with other spaces and places, and those who are unable to assemble with us on the ground. And so I finish with an invitation for you to join me next year in Prague, if you can, physically or digitally, where we will assemble to explore the rare particulars of performance spaces. Performance is dynamic and performance spaces are dynamic too. They are sites of encounter, appearance, imagination, and resistance. And they are a necessary means by which we continue to work out how to live with each other in our lively but fractured and damaged world. My hope for the performance space exhibition at next year's PQ is that it can provoke us to think afresh about the possible post-pandemic futures for performance spaces.
One question: if the assemblage, because it's French, besides catalyzing social and community actions, would catalyze also transformation or reflections on the aesthetic field? About aesthetics.
The field of aesthetics, yes.
Field of aesthetics.
Yes, I think so. And I think that thank you for that question. I think that is really what I'm interested in finding out. I think it is at these points where the nature of the assemblage, say with the example of Slunglo, how does this shift our notion of aesthetics? How does it shift our notion of what theatre can be fundamentally? Because the assemblage thinking that they're involved in, which is responding to necessity, it's responding on the basis of values to those who are in front of them, actually shifts what that company comes to understand as theatre. That theatre production, theatrical production, can be involve different forms of cultural production. I think that's what's terrifically exciting about Slunglo. And they did it under crisis, you know, because of the nature of what was happening to them and their community. And I think what they've come out with is a much kind of expanded sense of what it is to be a theatre company. And that idea that the only way we can justify theatre is because we now have to engage with the material needs of those who are around us. And the reason they didn't stop people from coming back for food again and again is because they said, in this community, the pandemic is a crisis, but the lack of economic means is a long-term condition. It's not a crisis. People do not have access to food. And so why would we stop them? We're going to redistribute the food through the means we have. I don't know if that answers the question, but I think, yes, I think the question is one that I hope will, you know, percolate through the exhibition as well, and some of the discussions that will take place there.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you. Do you have already many inscriptions, many people registered in the performance space exhibition? You have them?
Yes.
How many people?
We have. Know. I have
because it's closed. I know it's closed, but I would like to know how many people are presenting works.
We're going to have anywhere between 30 to 50 odd. I probably have about a long list of 40 to 60 at the moment. The reason I'm not being more specific about what works are in it is because I'm in the process right now, and
no, of course you don't have to tell me about the people who went. No, no. I went to the 2019. Our laboratory presented the work. It was interesting. It was very interesting. There's another question from Portugal. If you could explain a little better the relation between materialities with the idea of performative assembly.
Absolutely.
Please.
I wonder, we had a chat with the translator shortly before the talk, and I think we were talking about how the word assembly might be translated into Portuguese, because there are different words for different types of assembly. And the act of assembling something, an object, is different from the act of gathering people together, and is also different from, say, the idea of a legislative assembly. So for me, I'm interested in playing with the way these three senses are tied up in the one English word assembly and kind of a coexistent. So I think for me, between materialities and the idea of performative assembly is seeking to say, well, how might the very materialities of the theatre, the performance spaces, how can we think about this as one great assemblage between these, rather than thinking about venue and thinking about bodies gathering, try and think about the multiplicity of these forces and these relations between different materials. So in essence, that came out of that Ever After project, where we were thinking about maybe performance design with its attention to different materials, different forces and relations. Maybe that's the kind of practice that brings together an assembly of people. And that assembly of people might be engaged with different materials. So Marjolaine Guldemont's wonderful work at the Euro Festival, I think that's where you see a kind of performative assembly between materials, but also processes, different creatures, bacteria, and people all working in a way which brings to the foreground processes of farming, but also processes of, you know, soil creation, growth, regeneration. I think it's that kind of getting into those entanglements and embeddedness that interests me when it comes to the relation between performative assembly and its specific relation to materialities. So Helder, I think that's my approach to your question. I hope it makes some sense.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, Andrew, that was very good. We thank you very much for your amazing speech. And well, I'm going to study quite a lot your paper because I will have to translate it for the book. So perhaps I'll ask you some things about some questions about the difficulty of translating some of the words, because I have discussed with Eloisa first, and I had the same doubts. It's a little bit difficult for translating into Portuguese. So thank you very much.